This is a review of the Tokina SZX 400mm f8 reflex lens. Tokina is a lens brand name produced by Kenko, and Kenko was kind enough to send me a copy of this lens for evaluation. Even so, the opinions contained in this review are my own. I will also be producing a more detailed written review of this lens as well, so if you prefer to read your reviews, check the link in the description or in the comments. Now, let's get back to the review, and don't forget to watch in 4K resolution. What you are looking at is a 400mm f8 mirror lens. Like other mirror lenses, its aperture is fixed at f8 and it is completely manual focus. Therefore, it's a bit of a specialty lens. Still, 400mm of reach is not always easy to obtain, so is this lens worth it for $329? In this review, I will attempt to answer this question from the point of view of a wildlife photographer. Build quality and usability. Let's first talk about the build quality. It's pretty good and the focus ring turns smoothly. There is one point I did not like about the focus ring though. The focus throw is very short. Therefore, it can be a bit hard to focus manually, even if you are using magnification or other focus aids on a mirrorless camera. The one exception is the macro range. This lens has very close focusing ability, up to 1 to 2.5. A lot of the focus throw is devoted to the macro range, so I'm thinking this lens was partially meant to appeal to macro shooters. The lens itself uses an interchangeable mount. You can order it with different mount adapters and these screw onto the lens. I do wish the adapter screwed onto the lens with a bayonet mount instead of a screw mount because it can unscrew a little if it's not totally tight. I'd recommend making sure it's on fairly tightly before using it. On the other hand, I didn't have any problems with it in the field. Overall, I am happy with the construction of this lens. Bokeh. Before we get on to the most important topic of image sharpness, I should mention that like all mirror lenses, the very nature of a mirror lens implies the out-of-focus circular highlights will have the shape of donuts. There are 3 points to be aware of concerning this donut bokeh. The first is that if used properly, such as in cases where the out-of-focus area is mainly a few specular highlights, then the donut bokeh can actually be interesting. Of course, this is a matter of taste, but I personally find them interesting under some conditions. The second point is that in some cases, the effect of the donut bokeh will be unnoticeable. This happens whenever the background is very far away and fairly uniform, and you are very close to your subject. For example, the background in this shot was just such a case. I was close to my subject, and the background was red brick, which meant that the background was blown out so much that the donut effect was not visible. Finally, the third point is that in some cases, the donut effect will be hideous. This is just a constraint of mirror lenses. Use them where they are strong and just be aware of this limitation. Aperture. Another thing you must know about this lens is that it has a f8 fixed aperture. Its f8 aperture means that you'll quickly run out of light in less than ideal conditions. In bird and wildlife photography, an f4 lens works in most cases. An f5.6 lens suffers a bit in lower light, but is still quite capable, but an f8 lens will suffer quite a bit, like this lens. Unlike many more modern lenses, this lens also does not have vibration reduction or optical stabilization. Although IBIS on most cameras will help a little, it does not compare to having a dedicated lens stabilization system. That means that you'll need to keep your shutter speed higher compared to if you're shooting something with lens stabilization, at least when it comes to still subjects. In short, you're going to get a lot more noise compared to using another lens that is faster and has lens stabilization. The aperture being fixed is not a huge problem in itself. Even if the aperture were adjustable, I would not really want to stop this lens down past f8 since it would mean gathering so little light. The one problem where an f8 aperture isn't so problematic is video. Shooting video at 30 frames per second only requires a shutter speed of 1/60, so it's less likely you'll run into insufficient light in these cases unless you're shooting in really dim conditions. Sharpness. Now what about sharpness? I've used quite a few long lenses from budget zooms to super telephoto primes, and I pay a lot of attention to image quality. Sharpness is one of the most important characteristics of a lens when it comes to wildlife. Most modern lenses are decently sharp, but with focal lengths at 400mm and beyond, there is still a lot of variation that can affect real-world results. Due to their design, mirror lenses will always have some sharpness limitations. They are typically less sharp than regular lenses and have lower contrast as well. For example, there is not much sense in comparing this lens to a typical non-catadioptropic lens, even one like the Tamron 150-600 G2 or the Olympus 100-400. These lenses will surely out-resolve a mirror lens. Instead, I will compare the sharpness of this lens to one of the best mirror lenses ever made, the Tamron 500mm 55mm f8 mirror lens, first introduced in 1983. I own this lens as well and have shot with it extensively because I have a soft spot for mirror lenses and their funky bokeh. As with all my lenses, I like to test them on a tripod with flash. In my test, I took shots with the Tokina 400mm of a $20 bill, and then I matched the field of view with my Tamron 500mm and took the same shots with the same exposure. Money is good because it has very small details, which strain a lens's resolving power. Here are the results. Compared to the Tamron 500mm 55mm lens, the Tokina 400mm f8 is quite a bit weaker. This means that the Tokina 400mm f8 is a bit challenging to use since the Tamron 500mm f8 isn't an especially sharp lens. In practice, this means that even in ideal conditions, once a bird is at typical distances of 4 meters or more, you will already notice a loss of feather detail. I could notice this immediately even through my viewfinder when I was shooting. In some cases, when I could get really close to a bird, then I could get enough detail. These cases will typically only happen with very tame birds in city parks. With the Tamron 55mm lens, I have no problem getting shots that are at least decent in quality at typical distances. The Tokina 400mm f8 can also get pretty nice shots in some conditions, but those conditions are definitely more restricted and require more care. I also tested this lens on two cameras, the Nikon Z6 and the Panasonic G9. Because the Panasonic G9 is a micro 4/3 camera with much smaller pixels, it shows the weaknesses of this lens a lot more. In contrast, on the Nikon Z6, I found the results much better. In effect, shooting on the Panasonic G9 is like taking a very small crop of the Nikon Z6 and adding more pixels. While this can give you more detail with very sharp lenses, more modest lenses will suffer. What does this mean practically? In my opinion, if you shoot this lens on a full-frame camera and don't crop too much, you will get much better results than if you use this lens on a micro 4/3 camera or even an APS-C camera. That means you will have to compose carefully and get the composition you want in camera instead of cropping in post. For other subjects, this lens is a bit more forgiving. In fact, this lens is pretty decent when it comes to portrait photography. True, 400mm is a very weird portrait focal length, but portrait photography does not demand the same level of resolution as wildlife photography. The Tokina 400mm f8 does have a couple of advantages. For one, it is extremely small for a 400mm lens. Also, being f8 makes it smaller than some modern 50mm lenses, and it makes a discreet lens to carry around. It is certainly smaller than the Tamron 500mm f8 55mm lens, which is itself a very small lens. So although I previously said that a micro 4/3 camera would not be ideal for this lens, the tiny Olympus EPL10 and this lens would make a very fun combination for casual birding. If you can get creative and take shots where sharpness isn't all that important, then I could definitely imagine creating some nice art with this lens. The Tokina 400mm f8 also has a very close focusing distance. It can magnify up to 1 to 2.5. In other words, an object that is 2.5 centimeters in real life can be projected up to 1 centimeter on the sensor. That is a 0.4 times magnification. You will simply never find this level of magnification on a regular 400mm lens. For example, the magnification of the Nikon 400mm f4.5 lens is just 0.16, which is 2.5 times less than this lens. For animals like butterflies and dragonflies, this level of magnification can be very useful. Conclusion. What are my overall thoughts? First, there are some situations where this lens could be very handy and could also be a good way to experiment with the 400mm focal length without buying something more expensive. On the other hand, this lens is fairly weak in terms of sharpness, even when compared to some other mirror lenses like the Tamron 55mm. Given that the Tamron is not much larger and a mint copy can be bought for around $200 on eBay, it might be worth considering instead. The only downside of the Tamron 55mm is that it has a maximum magnification of 0.33x compared to the 0.4x of the Tokina. I would still consider this lens if lens size is a top priority. In this case, the Tokina 400mm f8 is a decent combination, especially if you use it carefully on a full-frame camera without cropping. Because of its mirror construction and f8 aperture, it is certainly one of the smallest and lightest 400mm lenses in existence. This lens could also be a very nice and compact solution for quick wildlife videos. Although you shouldn't expect amazing prime-level quality from it, the lower resolution demands of video will mask some of the weaknesses of this lens, and it might allow you to be more mobile and get more footage that would be harder to get with a larger and heavier lens. Should you get this lens? Well, you should get this lens if you are not primarily a wildlife shooter and just want to experiment with the 400mm focal length once in a while. If you need the smallest, lightest 400mm lens for relatively tame subjects, or if you need something very small for video production. But you should not get this lens if you want to produce high-quality wildlife shots with some regularity, if you need to crop or need a lot of sharpness, or if you don't mind the larger size of the Tamron 500mm 55mm, and you can find it on eBay. Thanks again to Kenko for sending me this lens. I enjoyed reviewing it and I hope you liked this video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below.